Are you frightened about the future of climate change? Or are you angry that governments want to implement changes to prevent it? What worries you more, rising sea levels or being forced to change your lifestyle to prevent rising sea levels? The whole discussion now revolves around two things: fear and anger. Campaigns to get governments and voters to pay attention to climate change used fear. Fear for the future, fear for our children, and fear for stability. The problem is, some politicians now use the same tactic to make climate change into a wedge issue to win votes. Fear for jobs, fear of expensive new technologies, fear of losing our freedom.
Fear is the path to the dark side.
I've scrapped it.
Fear leads to anger.
I've scrapped it.
Anger leads to hate.
I've scrapped it.
Hate leads to suffering.
I've scrapped those too.
I sense much fear in you.
There is no sponsor on this video today because net zero is a political hot potato. But this subject matters to me, and I know it matters to my subscribers. I surveyed the channel and a solid majority believe it is necessary to act on climate change now, regardless of the cost. And that worries me too, because it shows the effect of fear. I believe we need to inject optimism into this discussion, to show that the future could be better and that it is worth investing now to build a more prosperous and stable economy. Let me show you what I mean. I've been a working architect for almost 2 decades, and I've spent my career designing private homes in the Edinburgh area. Over that time, the background music of my working life has been a constant requirement to increase the energy efficiency of new homes. Compared to when I began, we now use almost double the thickness of insulation in walls, roofs and floors, while the glazing in windows and doors is almost 50% more efficient than it was 20 years ago. This change happened because a succession of governments committed to cut the UK's CO2 emissions by making our new homes more energy efficient. This drive is a major part of the UK's net zero strategy, but this approach has serious downsides. Homes become more expensive, have less natural light, and reduced internal space. External walls have become thicker to accommodate more insulation. 20 years ago, 90mm of insulation was sufficient. These days, it usually takes 140 to 160mm of insulation. Cavities have become larger and timber frame studs have gone from 90mm to 145mm just to accommodate that extra insulation. Now, that might not sound like much, but think about your home. Imagine the walls closing in and every room getting 2 or 3 inches smaller and costing more for the privilege. Not only do we have to pay for the extra insulation, we also need wider foundations to cope with those thicker walls. By my calculations, compared to a house built in 2005, a new 200 square metre home now costs over £23,000 extra just for the additional insulation required by our building regulations. And that's not counting the increased cost of windows and doors designed to meet ever tighter energy efficiency requirements, or the cost of thicker walls, floors, roofs and foundations to accommodate that extra insulation. I've posted the calculation on my Insta, there's a link in the description. You can argue that the extra expense will be recovered over time because the new buildings cost less to heat, but we aren't comparing a new home to a Victorian tenement, we're comparing it to a home from just 18 years ago. By historical standards, these were already very efficient buildings, so the relative payback period will be over decades. So what can we do? I know that net zero covers more than just house building or even the construction industry, but this is the part of net zero that affects me professionally. I am just a very small cog in a very big machine. The UK construction industry employs over 3 million people and is worth £240 billion annually. I only see a tiny part of the puzzle, but what is now becoming obvious is that building regulations have focused exclusively on the demand side of the equation. We have significantly increased the construction cost of new homes because heating those homes releases carbon dioxide, leading to climate change. But while we have been doing this, a very different story has been playing out on the supply side of the equation. Compared to when I started 2 decades ago, the UK now generates a massive and growing portion of its electricity from renewables. Because about 80% of UK homes use natural gas for heat, it was imperative to make any new homes as thermally efficient as possible to reduce the amount of gas consumed and CO2 released. But while that was going on, the national grid shifted from coal to natural gas and now onto wind to generate electricity for the UK. And this has given us a golden opportunity. If we can reliably generate, store and use electricity from zero carbon sources, what would happen if we shifted our heating systems from gas to electric? The argument for insulating our homes to cut carbon goes out the window, and I don't see anyone in public life making this optimistic argument. I'm a professional, and predicting the future isn't something I'm comfortable doing. I prefer to deal in facts. Selling people a promised land is what politicians do. I think we should shift from trying to scare people into action to instead selling a vision of running the economy on cheap, reliable, zero-carbon electricity that doesn't jump in price every time there's a war and that can heat our homes at a fraction the current cost. The world after net zero must be something worth building, otherwise we'll never get there. And I don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but I strongly suspect that if we can heat our homes using renewable electricity rather than natural gas, then we can roll back the regulations requiring expensive insulation, and that means we can build new homes that cost less money. This should be a win-win, but I can already see different groups lining up to give me a kicking in the comments section. The ideological arm of the environment movement will see this as heresy and condemn me for enabling big business. The big businesses that make insulation will try to dismiss this as unworkable. My fellow professionals in the UK housing industry will say that grid-scale renewables aren't our responsibility and we should stick with business as usual. The people who actually build renewable generation will say we are years away from being able to consider this. And every one of them has a point, which is why this needs political leadership. Someone needs to sell the promised land to the electorate. We are now at the point where the net zero project has become another battleground in the culture wars. There is a real chance that politicians might give up on climate change policies entirely because some voters see net zero as a threat to their lifestyle. The UK government made a half-baked effort to get us using air source heat pumps, but these are very expensive at present and can't directly replace a gas boiler because they don't produce as much heat. If you install a heat pump, you need more or bigger radiators to make best use of them, and the older your home, the worse it gets. The problem with heat pumps isn't really to do with their cost or worries over their ability to heat older properties. The problem is that the government is trying to get homeowners and house builders to solve climate change. They are fixating on the demand side of the equation and not spending enough time talking about the supply side. If we can transition the UK's electricity grid to a renewable model, this will solve the problem at the national level, and not just for new buildings, but for all buildings. Instead of subsidising heat pumps, the government should subsidise battery storage, smart meters and hot water cylinders. This way, our homes can store the electricity and heat in the middle of the night when the wind blows but no one is using the electricity. We don't need homeowners and house builders to innovate. We already have the technology to reap the benefits of cheap, low-carbon electricity. We need to invest more in grid-scale storage so we can move away from natural gas as the base load generation for the national grid, and we need to build far more infrastructure like wind, solar and nuclear generation. I admit I don't know the costs, timescales or technical details of how to achieve this, and I suspect neither do the politicians. What I do know is the technology already exists to do this, but we need the politicians to start focusing on what it means for the average person, and to start speaking about the opportunities rather than trying to use fear to make us cooperate. We have just lived through a massive spike in energy costs. Everyone would love to hear how the UK could move towards cheaper electricity, not subject to the whim of the international gas market, and using that cheaper electricity to heat our buildings will allow new homes to be built for less. I would like us to stop living in fear and start living in hope.